Ask Reddit by Iglis Yoke. Serious, what dark family secret were you let in on once you were old enough? Attention. Serious. Tag notice. Jokes, puns, and off-topic comments are not permitted. https://www.reddit.com/r/wiki/index-wiki_rule_6- in any comment parent or child. Parent comments that aren't from the target group will be removed, along with their child replies. Report comments that violate these rules. Posts that have few relevant answers within the first hour, and posts that are not appropriate for the serious tag will be removed. Consider doing an AMA request instead. Thanks for your cooperation and enjoy the discussion. I am a bot, and this action was performed automatically. Please, contact the moderators of this subreddit. Message compose $?r ask Reddit if you have any questions or concerns. Why all stories are wild. Mine is super tame. When I was in my early 20s, I found an old photo of someone in a family album I didn't recognize. When I asked my mom about it, she said, "Oh, that's your Aunt Gloria." Then she lowered her voice, even though we were alone, and added, "She's a nudist. Poor Aunt Gloria just wants to be a nudie lady and everyone acts like she's a leper." I aspire to be a Gloria. I found out I had a sister who had been given up for adoption. The only reason I found out was the person who informed me no longer felt bound to secrecy after my mom died. And the person who told me had receipts solid enough that I have no reason to doubt them. It also explains why mom freaked out when I told her I'd done a 23andMe test. 23andMe is how my father discovered he had a bonus cousin. Turns out his uncle had a fling before leaving for WWII that resulted in a child he either never told anyone about or didn't even know himself. When my father looked her, the cousin, up, she happened to live in the same city. He and my aunts contacted her and all met up for lunch. Turns out the woman had been searching for years to find her father's side of family. As far as I know, they still keep in touch. My uncle was actually my cousin. He was kidnapped as an infant, and when he was returned a year later, my aunt didn't want him back. My grandparents adopted him, so he was legally my uncle. Kidnapped and then they didn't want him back. What the hell? Excuse me for asking, but was the kidnapping legit or was it set up to get rid of him? This is so sad. My extremely wealthy uncle was going downhill quick with Alzheimer's. Before he was too far gone, he apparently made a deal with my aunt that when things got to the point that they would have to send him to a nursing home, she would kill him instead. He wrote all of this in a letter and gave it to the attorney of their estate. When the time came, I don't know why she chose to shoot him in the back of the head instead of something less violent, but she did. It was a pretty big trial with a fair bit of news coverage, and it really blew up when the lawyer testified and brought forward the letter. My aunt served like 2 years, I think, and was released on parole. That's extremely sad, but also really badass of both of them. I'm sorry for everyone who was involved. I found out when I was about 32 that apparently in 1973 my dad had a daughter he never knew existed. I found out because he texted that to me while I was working, after finding out about it himself about 1 week earlier. She was in her late 40s by that point, I think. What's sort of tragic is all this time we thought I was my dad's only kid, and he always wanted a daughter but never got one due to marriage's ending. He would have fucking loved this girl. His daughter was the result of a one-night stand with a girl he never talked to again, and according to his daughter, the mother had a mental breakdown not longer after giving birth and never really had custody of the daughter anyway. Dad never would have had any way to find out. The baby grew up with the mother's parents in another state, and the mother kinda went AWOL. My uncle molested my mom. I don't understand how he is still welcome in the family. Familial sexual abuse is one of the most horrifying, damaging crimes, and it is also probably the most covered up, rug-swept crime. I will never understand it either. I found out when I was in my early 30s that my mom hadn't only had 4 kids, but actually 6, but gave 2 up for adoption before I was born. Also, I was the last baby she had with some rando before she married my stepdad, and she had intended to give me up for adoption as well. Silver lining? One of the babies she gave up contacted her a few years after I learned about this, and now I have an awesome new brother. Found out about a half-sibling later in life too. He's nice and I felt oddly comfortable and familiar around him immediately. It's extremely unfortunate though the rest of my family wants nothing to do with him and are mad at me for reaching out at all. I only get met with anger or non-answers when I press the issue too. My parents and sibling have all gotten really weird in the decade or so this all unfolded. There's so much going, otherwise I don't think it's the main reason, but I feel like I'm not being told something about the situation I should know. My grandpa, 15, kidnapped my grandma, 14, from a convent. No one even bothered looking for her thereafter cause she was an orphan and didn't even know who her family was. They had 16 children together. It's extremely upsetting when you dig into many people's grandparents' great-grandparents' stories in my country, because kidnapping young girls to marry them was considered normal. Not terribly dark, but as an adult my dad told me he used to be a coke addict and quit shortly before I was conceived. It's interesting to look at now because he's pretty straight edge in his older years, doesn't even drink beer. Wonderful person though. My grandfather had severely scarred legs from burns he got as a kid. Growing up we were told that he was in a fire in an apartment building and sustained the burns while escaping. He died when I was 7, and one of my few memories of him is an image of those scarred legs. Well, when I was 23, my great aunt, his sister, told me that it wasn't a fire. Their father ran a bath with scalding water and put my grandfather in it as a punishment. Great-grandfather was an abusive alcoholic piece of shit who fucking maimed his son. My mom poured boiling water on my legs when I was around 2. I have a small weird scar and some freckling where the scar is, but that's it at this point. I had a really shitty mom. My paternal grandmother had an affair with our small town's mortician in the 1940s. She got pregnant and he performed an illegal abortion. The fetus was buried behind the funeral home he owned where we kids used to sled every winter. My dad told me this as I was getting ready to take a ride down the hill on the sled when I was 12. Also, paternal grandfather had multiple illegitimate children around our small town. Turns out one of my best friends was also my half-cousin. Father told me when I was 17. My father was educated, intelligent, honest and moral. The fact that his parents were so wild was absolutely shocking to me. Or, so little kid you is trying to get some sledding in and you find out you're sledding over your loved one's secret grave. That's awful. It's nice your dad was straight up with you though. That my biological mother used to give me heroin and Valium as a baby and toddler to control me, then drop me off at my grandmother's house when she couldn't afford to share, so I'd go through withdrawals but no one would know what was wrong. Needless to say, I was put up for adoption to get me away from that. Jesus, I hope you're doing okay now. That my grandma didn't lose her leg to cancer, she lost it because she got injured helping my grandpa fix the roof, and my grandpa was too cheap to have it fixed properly, so he told the doctor to cut it off. Then he beat the crap out of her for life. I remember my mother lying on the couch in pain when I was a kid. My dad apparently would pay for her teeth repair and she had them all pulled at age 35, wore dentures until she passed at 96. That was cruel. I'm religious about my teeth getting fixed. When I was very young, my family lived in a townhouse, and against all local bylaws, my mother decided to keep the horse in our backyard. Not only that, but it was an ex-race horse that came as a package deal, the goat companion that slept in the closet of my nursery. I also later found out she was running a grow-up in the basement. This is so nice to read after all the other entries about child rape and murder. Not exactly dark, but I found out my father wrote porn novels under a pen name to make ends meet when I was a baby. I've been trying to find one ever since. Shame too, you might have been able to launch one of the most successful podcasts of all time if you had. I knew my grandfather was a coal miner, and that he was really involved with the union, but it wasn't till after he died that I found out just how much of a union man he was. If something needed blowing up or someone needed to not be breathing anymore, they called Gramps. After he died, my brother remembers some men coming to visit Gran and giving her a lot of envelopes. She took off for a year-long vacation in Europe after that. Edit. For all the people saying my Gramps was a great man, thank you for the kind thoughts, but seeing something you think is cool on Reddit is not the reality. He wasn't a good husband and he wasn't a great father to 3 of his daughters, although he loved my mama very much, as well as me and my brothers and cousins. Being a violent person for good reasons does not make you a good person. It just makes you a means to an end. That's my Kermantraut. My grandpa can't have kids, but my mother still has 3 siblings. The old Jonas Venture special. When my grandma's gentleman friend was admitted into a care home for his dementia, they had a problem in verifying his medical records. As he deteriorated, he lost his Irish accent and would occasionally speak in German. He was a child during WW2. My parents reckon he was probably a Jewish escapee. This happened to my great aunt. She was a German Jew and she got Alzheimer's. She forgot her husband, then forgot she wasn't trying to escape the Nazis, then forgot how to speak English and spoke in German thinking she was a teenager, then forgot how to speak, then died. Alzheimer's is not the best. I don't know about dark, but here goes. My great-grandfather murdered the mayor of the village he lived in. Why? Because the mayor was sleeping with his mom while his father worked on the field. I think he was 15 or 16 when he did that. Edit. You're wild here. When I said I don't know about dark, I meant compared to being related to serial killers, drugs, rapes and incest like some of the comments here. That's first. Second, what happened to the mom? Obviously, my great-grandfather was not this heartless, so he never told his father. He told my mom, that's my mom's grandfather, sorry I didn't specify, that he confessed to his mom on her deathbed what he did. I don't know about dark. Proceeds to tell story about infidelity and murder. My dad's side of the family has ties with the mafia. Thankfully my mom has long since divorced my dad and their life a decent distance apart. I heard stories of my mom's parents who lived close by at the time circling the block in their truck late at night soon after the divorce to ensure no one was there to hurt us. I was very young at this point, probably like 3-4, so I really have no memory of this. I do remember one night our garbage can was burned to the ground, and my mom has since told me about death threats soon after the divorce. My mom a couple years ago watched a documentary on prominent mafia families and noted multiple names that were at her wedding. I don't think my family was actually involved in the mafia, but my mom has told us several times that my great-grandfather ran a very successful laundromat, and also that a noted member of the mafia attended his funeral. My dad left when I was 7 and we were always told that it just didn't work out with my parents. We saw him off and on for about 2 years after he left, then never saw him again. He had remarried and she had a kid that became his stepson that my brother and I would hang with when we would go to my dad's house. Then when I turned 13 my mom finally told me that the stepson was actually his son from having an affair with that woman. So that kid was my half brother and I had no clue. Found out one of my close relatives was a trigger man for a crime family, was killed at his daughter's school functions. The problem with killing people for money is that you're inherently working for someone who is willing to solve problems with paid homicide. What happens when they decide you know too much? My great-aunt's husband killed his first wife, then killed her. They lived in Puerto Rico and he fled to Nick so my great-uncles wouldn't kill him. They found out where he was, came here, killed him, and went home. Edit, typo. Isn't it scary how succinct the explanation of things like this can be? Great-grandma died from a botched abortion when she got pregnant a 7th time. I knew someone whose grandmother died trying to abort number 24 in Sicily in the 40s. Found out my dad's mom was a lesbian and that my godmother who lived with both my grandfather and grandmother was actually her lover. They slept in the same bed while my grandfather had his own room. Growing up I had no idea, but as I got older I pieced it together. But I loved them all and still do. R.I.P. My dad secretly had a vasectomy after I was born, after my mom lying to him about taking birth control resulted in my birth. Our family is great at communication and conflict resolution. Lol, I'm glad we all have screwed up histories. I found my half-sister when she was 25 because my nephew did the DNA test on Ancestry.com. We pulled my dad aside to tell him what we discovered and he replied with, "That's the biggest secret that I've kept for 25 years. He was banging her married mom and got pregnant. She always felt different as she was really petite, tan skin and curly hair. None of which was in her family. Meeting her was like looking through a mirror into my childhood. She's my twin." My grandfather didn't pass from a heart attack due to old age. He killed himself. I found out a few months after he died that my grandfather killed himself with a couple of nails from a nail gun to the temple. I was 25, but it still wigs me out to think about it. I wasn't let in on it, so to speak. My dad is Polish and I took a DNA test. Turns out I'm 100% not Polish. I look exactly like my dad. My dad looks nothing like his father. There is a somewhat famous story about this. An Irish mother gave birth at a hospital to a son. The mother died while young and the son grew up as effectively an orphan due to his father not being able to support him. Kind of made being Irish part of his identity. After he was dead, his daughter took a DNA test to discover she was half Jewish. So were her siblings. Her mother wasn't Jewish. And her dad was supposedly 100% Irish. They finally figured it out when one of her Irish cousins took a DNA test that matched to a Jewish family who discovered they were half Irish. Their dad was born at the same hospital on the same day as her dad. The hospital had accidentally mixed up the babies after birth. I wasn't let in on it, more like I found out about it, but my siblings have a different dad than I do. That was common knowledge and not the secret at all. The secret was that their dad actually didn't die in the hospital of a terminal illness. He died of suicide when he threw himself from the window of the hospital he was slowly dying in. Not super dark or super secret, but when I had to do a project on my family tree in elementary school, one of the questions was, when did your family immigrate to America and why? For one of my great-grandfathers, my grandma told me life was very hard back in his country, and it was getting dangerous to stay there, and for a long time I thought, yeah, I can see that. It was probably hard for a teenager living in Poland with WWI right around the corner. And I'm sure it was. But it turns out it's even harder and more dangerous when you're a teenager who has slept with a married woman and then accidentally killed her husband when he confronted you. I can see why she didn't want me to put that on my elementary school project. Edit, wrong World War. I just pulled up his Ellis Island records and he immigrated in 1912 aboard the Carpathia in August. This makes me wonder how many of those projects are basically lies. I bet many parents don't want their kids saying some shit like, well, after my grandma's sister was beheaded, they decided to pack up and come here. My grandmother married her second husband entirely for money. Her daughters both like to joke about her intentionally giving him a heart attack. He had heart problems but liked to eat unhealthy food, and the rumor goes she would put extra salt and butter on his food until he finally kicked the bucket. Here's a dark secret I am keeping myself. My late Phil pretty much did this to himself. My partner knows Phil stopped doing his prescribed walking and ate lots of fast food after Mill died. That was too obvious to hide, since we went to live with him for a while. What I kept to myself were the multiple unopened bottles of Xaralto I found when we were clearing out that house. Also another one I've forgotten the name of. Presumably, he kept refilling the scripts so his doctor wouldn't catch on. But then he chucked them in a drawer and only took them when we came to visit. He died emotionally when Mill passed on. They'd been genuinely devoted to each other and she was his world. It took 16 months for his body to catch up. He had a massive stroke and died a day or so later. My great-grandmother was shot dead in the street by an ex-boyfriend, in front of my 4-year-old grandma and her 2 younger brothers. It happened in a really quiet European town and I believe it made the papers. Grandma ended up being sent to live with an aunt and the boys stayed with their father and he remarried a nasty abusive woman. I didn't know this until I was 18. From the older boy actually, Uncle Jay, but hearing this story really changed my perspective on Grandma and the boys. The boys both ended up going to prison and having difficult lives, and Grandma was a stern, unemotional woman. I feel like this gave me some understanding as to why. I was told by my aunt, before my parents thought it necessary, that my dad had cheated on my mum and slept with a stripper and that I was her daughter and not actually my mother's. I found out years later that my dad wasn't actually my dad either, though he thought he was, which is why he put his name on my birth certificate and brought me home when my birth mother wanted nothing to do with me. Fun times. So, you are not biologically related to either of your parents? Just found this one out recently. My uncle was a doctor working in a small town hospital. He was married and had just had a baby boy. While his wife was pregnant or just had the baby, he had an affair with 2 nurses in the hospital and ended up getting one of the nurses pregnant. When he found out of the second kid, he took his family and fucked off to New Zealand for 3 years. Upon returning to Canada in the same small town hospital, his wife immediately found out about his illegitimate child and divorced him. My illegitimate cousin stopped coming around to family events, and when I talked to him about it last year, he told me that my grandparents always blamed him for ruining my uncle's marriage. I love that grown adults will blame a child for existing. My uncle raped his own younger sister for years and nothing was really done about it. How awful. My mom's cousin, my second cousin, molested her growing up multiple times. She was apparently getting molested herself by her brother ? I think. Later on, that cousin got married to a guy who went on to molest their daughter they had together. Came out later he was keeping a treasure trove of child pornography in the house, with bits of their daughter included in that. He was busted by the police, which ended in a shootout in some random business building, made the news and everything. He got shot and died during this whole ordeal. They're probably the 2 most fucked up individuals I've ever known. My grandpa's stepdad's side, first wife tried to murder him, and went to prison for it. Then also, my aunt, mom's side, was pimped out by her husband for decades. A family member walked in on my mother breaking my arm by holding me only by it when I was 2. Didn't say anything for fear of breaking up a family. Mother abused me my whole life and even after cutting contact 3 years ago is still trying to ruin my life. This family member told me the story casually and acted as if they'd done me a favor because I could have ended up in care. Had to pull back from all of them now because of the realization they were all bystanders and let it go on without a word. I was 6 or 7 when my father died. He was a terrible alcoholic, but I didn't understand alcohol as a kid. I'm 19 now and my mother has told me he wasn't just an alcoholic, he was a chronic liar, manipulator and abuser. He strangled a dog and killed it in front of my mom cause she was going to leave him. He was addicted to cocaine, and when he didn't have any alcohol, my mom go get more or he'd kill another animal. He'd frequently beat the ever-living shit out of my mom, and when she finally left with him, my entire family both on my mom's and father's side talked shit about her for leaving and didn't care about mine or her well-being. Worst part is when suing for custody he actually got weekends, and then on Sunday would take me to the super nice churches that judges and lawyers involved with the case went to. This might be a bit too weird for this thread. I am from a country still enshrined in a lot of superstition and religion. My great-great-grandmother was a crazy woman who practiced witchcraft. One day her husband died unnaturally, he was murdered or something by the village, and Granny went mad. She gathered the village folk around and picked up a rock from the ground nearby and declared that the rock will be her curse and the village will suffer for killing her husband. After that she killed herself. For multiple generations my family worshipped the rock as a deity and prayed to lift the curse from the village. It ended when my father in his 20s got sick of his family doing stupid shit. Him and his cousin stole the rock overnight from someone's house and threw it near a railway track. And now I wish I was making this shit up, but my father, uncles and aunts all told me this story when I grew up. If I knew your father, my entire life would become placing rocks in random places for him to find. That's it. It would be my life's work. My wife was molested by her brother and basically everyone except her dad knew it was going on and did nothing. I wouldn't say this is something I found out when I was old enough, but found out after my wife and I had been together a while when we were dating. My granddad's parents were collaborators in WWII. He was only 6 when the war ended, so he was innocent, but his dad regularly hosted Nazi officers who ran the city where they lived and helped them arrest resistance members. Whilst my grandmother's parents were actually resistance fighters and helped downed British and American pilots escape and hide, as well as provided passports to Jewish people. Kind of a wild story, but that was the state back in the 1940s here. Either you kept your head down and kept a low profile, either you helped the Nazis and profited from the occupation, or you fought them wherever you could. My father knew my mother from a young age and adopted her. Raised her with his wife, at the time, and her son. Then married her when she turned 18. That's super fucked up. My great-grandparents got drunk and locked 2 of my uncles out of the house late at night in the middle of winter. My great-grandparents wouldn't wake up and my uncles couldn't get in, so they tried to walk to their grandma's house that was like 15 miles away, and one of them froze to death and the other had to have his feet and hands amputated because of frostbite. My great-grandparents lied about what happened and said they snuck out. It was in the newspaper and was made out to be this heartbreaking story about 2 dumb little kids who snuck out in the middle of the night because they wanted to see their grandma. Holy shit, that breaks my heart and makes my blood boil. My grandma was a very bad driver, and apparently, when she was in her 30s, she hit and killed a special needs girl who lived in her neighborhood. My dad took me out for a walk when I was in middle school to tell me that I have a half-brother in Japan with a similar name and birthday as me. We have the same dad, different moms. My brother has known about me his whole life, as a sister who lives in the States, but I only found out about his existence on that day. Met a girl whose dad was a successful entrepreneur in Asia and had 4 different families spread out in the region. This girl learned at 14 that she had a half-sister with the same first name because they were born a few weeks apart and the father didn't want to confuse the daughters' names when hanging out with their respective mothers. When I was 15-16 my parents got liquored one summer night with a bunch of their friends and I was told the story of how our house was bought from a murderer. Dude and his wife lived in the house my parents bought for I think 10 years, maybe less. Whatever triggered him, they didn't know, but he beat her to death with a cast iron pan and strangled her with a belt for good measure, left the body in the backyard poorly buried. He tried to kill himself by drinking a gallon of WD-40 and drowning himself in a body of water very close to where I live. However, he tried to drown himself when the tide was coming and wasn't very successful, and the police found him half dead on the beach the next day after a neighbor got super suspicious about the grave in the backyard, and also all the sketchy noises he heard the night before. I think he got 15 years for it, but I have no idea what his name is. I couldn't pry that part out of my parents, but his name was the last one on the house before my parents bought it when I was 4. That my grandfather was a horribly abusive alcoholic and he died in a fire that started because he passed out drunk with a lit cigarette. Several actually involving my paternal grandfather, Pa. He was a cattle rancher and long-distance truck driver. Pa was a terrible alcoholic who beat my granny on several occasions. My father was the one who would save her. He took several beatings doing this until he was old enough to stand his own against his drunken father. He ran off and married another woman that he had been having an affair with for years. He had 4 boys with my granny and 4 children with the other woman as well. When granny found out and found him, she took him to court and the judge sent him home with her to raise my dad and uncles. She had to write the child support checks until the youngest turned 18. He had several children with other women, only a few we actually knew about. In his later years he was proud of all the kids he had all over the country. One of his daughters moved in with him after granny died, and a couple of years later they had a daughter. They were both fully aware that they were father and daughter. Oh my fucking goodness, that last line really did me in.